the characteristic of impersonal nature basically requires or tells us that a thing must be outside of the human body. Okay, so it's not something that can be part of the human body or the human body itself. So in that sense, it refers to the idea that a person or human being or its body parts cannot be a thing. In terms of the doctrine of legal subjectivity, humans are not regarded as things. The doctrine of legal subjectivity requires us to distinguish between legal subjects and legal objects. Legal objects refer to the broader concept of property and the smaller category thereof called things, while legal subjects refer to human beings, natural persons and juridical persons. These are two separate categories. Now, since humans are legal subjects, humans cannot be legal objects, or more specifically, they cannot be things that can be owned and sold. In other words, they cannot be dealt with in commerce, they cannot be traded, they are not negotiable. However, an horrible exception to the strict distinction between legal subjects and legal objects existed when slavery was possible. Slavery permitted humans to be treated as property. In other words, they could be traded and meaning sold, owned in commerce. It was, however, abolished. In other words, slavery was, however, abolished in South Africa in 1834. In 1996, with the promulgation of the Constitution, and in particular the right to human dignity, everyone acquired the right to their dignity being protected. This provision in effect makes it impossible for something like slavery to resurface. So, the general rule is that humans and human body parts cannot qualify as things. Exceptions to this general rule, specifically with regard to human body parts that have been separated from the human body, however, do exist in law. We find some of these exceptions in the Human Tissue Act as well as the National Health Act. So both the Human Tissue Act and the National Health Act has exceptions to this general rule, or includes exceptions to the general rule that human body parts is not or cannot qualify as things and therefore cannot form part of commerce. These statutes allow for body parts such as blood, for blood transfusions, sperm and ova donations, transplanting of organs, to be dealt with in commerce by way of donation and not trade. And this process is also heavily regulated by the relevant statutes. So this means that the negotiability of these exceptions that includes blood, sperm and ova, and organs are regulated by the Human Tissues Act and the National Health Act, and heavily regulated as well, and mostly can only take place if donated, so not necessarily traded. So that is then specifically with regards to human body parts such as organs, blood, sperm, ova, etc. However, there's a question about renewable body parts. What about renewable body parts such as hair? Can they be traded? The test here is whether it can be separated. In other words, the renewable body part can be separated without causing harm. If so, it can be traded with and falls inside of commerce. So it's then a negotiable legal object, which is specifically a thing. And an example of this would be the one indicated on the slide. So hair, we know that hair is bought and sold on the market in commerce, and there's a big market for it. So the test that is applied there is, can it be separated without causing harm? And because hair can be separated without causing harm, it can be traded and it falls within commerce. So it qualifies as a thing for purposes of property law. Another characteristic of a thing is the characteristic of appropriability. So what do we mean with appropriability? An object is appropriable if it is susceptible to human control. In this regard, an object is susceptible to human control if a human can exercise and enforce his or her rights over the object. So if it's not possible to exercise rights and enforce rights over the object, then the object cannot be said to be susceptible to human control, or synonym, it cannot be said that the object is appropriable. Now, examples of objects that is not susceptible to human control would be heavenly bodies. So the stars and the moon and planets are not susceptible to human control. I've placed a link on the slide. If you go onto that link, it's a website that allows you to buy rights in the moon, land, etc. But given this characteristic of a thing, namely appropriability, it must be understood that one cannot necessarily buy land on the moon or on Mars, as long as one cannot exercise and enforce one's rights over the property and protect one's rights over the property. Okay, so because we cannot really do that, that which is bought via this website would not be a valid right in the object, because the object doesn't qualify as a thing. So you cannot buy for your mom, your dad, your boyfriend, or girlfriend a piece of land on the moon for Valentine's Day or Christmas, for instance, because you would not receive ownership or any type of right recognized in the law of things over it. It is also important to note that there are some objects that can become appropriable. In other words, some objects that were not appropriable can become appropriable. And an example of this would be free-flowing air. When it is contained in a container, one can exercise rights over it and enforce one's rights over it, making it fall under human control. And finally, use and value is then the final characteristic of a thing that we are going to look at. Now, what is meant with use and value? The purpose of the object must be to satisfy the needs of human beings. It must be destined to satisfy the needs of human beings. Thus, it must be of value and use to humans. So, use and value is the point of departure. Now, how is value defined in this context or determined in this context? Value can be economical or sentimental. And an example of sentimental, something that would have sentimental value, is a family portrait or a letter from a deceased family member. What must be remembered regarding value is that an objective test is applied to determine value. In other words, an outsider test is applied, not a subjective test. So the question is what an outsider or third party would regard as valuable given the circumstances. Thus, context is important to determine value. Now, as a general rule, only positive value is regarded as value for an object to qualify as a thing, not negative value. So dangerous objects and unwanted objects would generally not qualify as things. However, there is an exception to this idea that only objects with positive value would qualify as things. This exception applies to chemical waste. Although chemical waste has negative value, it is regarded as a thing. This can be ascribed to the need that the owner of the chemical waste must take responsibility for it and must be held liable, or it must be possible to hold the owner liable if the waste is not dealt with properly. So those are the characteristics of a thing. Independence, corporeality, of impersonal nature, susceptible to human control, and use and value. As indicated when we looked at the corporeality requirement, there's a debate specific to the corporeality characteristic. And this debate is about whether or not corporeality must be seen as a strict requirement for some object to qualify as a thing for purposes of protection under the law of property, or regulation rather, under the protection of the law of things, not the law of property, or whether or not it should be regarded merely as a guideline. So it's just a guideline, it can be deviated from. Now, this debate around how the corporeality requirement must be approached can also be pulled through to how the characteristics as a whole, so all of the characteristics should be approached. In this sense, one can also say that there's potential argument to be made for a strict approach to all the characteristics, or a flexible approach to all the characteristics. Now, if we say that the strict approach is applied to all the characteristics of a thing, that means that these characteristics are regarded as strict requirements. Where one of the characteristics are not present or cannot be met, the object will not qualify as a thing. And where we have situations where legislation or case law, for instance, acknowledges or recognizes an object that doesn't have one of these strict requirements as a thing, that situation must be regarded as an exception. So in other words, the strict approach says that where there's deviation from these strict requirements in legislation or in case law, that deviation is an exception. So the strict approach sees these deviations as exceptions. And just to sort of underscore, with a strict approach, the characteristics are seen as essential characteristics or essential requirements. On the other hand, an argument can be made that a flexible approach should rather be employed when determining whether or not objects qualify as things. This means that the characteristics, those 5 characteristics that we've identified, must only function as flexible guidelines and not requirements. So an object is not required to strictly adhere to all the characteristics to constitute a thing under the flexible approach. Going to underscore, they are seen as general characteristics, not essential characteristics or essential requirements. And in this sense, where there is deviations from these characteristics of corporeality, impersonal nature, independence, susceptibility to human control, and use and value, those deviations are not seen as exceptions. Why? Because the characteristics are mere guidelines. They are seen as forming part of the inquiry and then result of what can qualify as a thing or what can't qualify as a thing. Because none of the characteristics are seen as strict requirements. So the question then is, what is the South African position or approach? Is the South African position or approach to what may qualify as a thing a strict one or a flexible one? How are the characteristics dealt with in South African law? So this is self-study. I need you to go back to each characteristic and then to the characteristics as a whole to determine the South African approach with regard to the application of all the characteristics. Are they approached as strict requirements or guidelines? Are they seen as essential characteristics or merely general characteristics? Can we say that we have exceptions in South African law? So it's important that you go back to each characteristic, determine the general position, and then see if there's deviations. Based on what you then establish from these general approaches and deviations, you can then make an argument for why you say that the South African position or approach is a strict one or a flexible one to the characteristics of things. So you'll use then those examples of deviations or lack of examples of deviations to justify one position over the other. This is covered extensively in the prescribed textbook as well as in the alternative online sources. So I really want you to engage with this and critically think about it. This then brings us to the end of our discussion with the first part of the study unit on things, study unit 2. You are now required to also look at the classification of things on your own, as mentioned earlier. Please do not skimp over it. As I've mentioned also earlier at the start of this narration, it's important that you understand the classification of things. Why? Because it tells you, or it gives you the tools, the terminology, and the understanding to distinguish between different things. Okay, so the stage in which we do classification is after something has been confirmed. Yes, it does qualify as a thing. It, generally speaking, has all these characteristics that a thing must have. Now we ask ourselves, what type of thing is this object? This is where the classification of things becomes important, because depending on the type of thing that you're dealing with, the acquisition, protection, also the transfer and loss of rights and over that thing is impacted and affected. The way in which it can be acquired, the way in which it can be protected, the way in which it can be lost, those things are all impacted by what type of thing or the nature of the thing. And the classification of things assists with understanding what type of thing you are dealing with.